Here's Deputy Secretary of State Nuland again. This is just over the weekend. It's unclear to whom she's speaking. It sounds as though she's speaking to Ukrainian leaders or elite in Ukraine. She may be in the U.S., but perhaps via the computer is speaking to them. But I'm interested to hear your thoughts on what she admits and what she expects.
And even as you plan for the counteroffensive, which we have been working on with you for some 4 or 5 months, we are already beginning our discussions with the Ukrainian government and with friends in Kyiv, both in the civilian side and on the military side, about Ukraine's long-term future.
We'll start with the offensive, about which they've been speaking since the wintertime. Spring is almost over. Tomorrow's the first day of June. I don't want to get semantic about whether it's truly a spring offensive, but are you surprised to hear her say in public, we, that either means the State Department, the CIA, the DOD, the Biden administration, the federal government, have been working with you on the spring offensive for 4 or 5 months? Why in God's name would she say that, even if it were true?
Well, she's very proud of it. And she wants to identify herself publicly with the entire crusade to destroy Russia. And that's what this is really all about. She's telling you the truth. And I'm sure that we have worked tediously for many, many months to try and organize for this thing, particularly as the Bakhmut, slaughterhouse was underway. That's why 30 to 35,000 Ukrainian soldiers who've been training at areas in the United States, Canada, Germany, the Czech Republic, and elsewhere are coming back to Ukraine. They're going to form the backbone for much of this offensive. They'll be augmented by whatever is still alive and can carry a weapon and so forth. So, no, I think she's telling you the truth, and she's very proud of that. The second part is actually more interesting.
Yes.
Because it reminds me of this scene. I don't know if you've seen it or not. Many of your viewers may have, in the movie Downfall. At the end, just before Hitler shoots himself in the bunker, one of the women comes up to him and says, "But mein Führer, what about the inevitable victory?" And he looks at her. He just turns his head away, goes into the room and shoots himself. Well, I think we're dealing with something similar to that. They're putting the cart way out ahead of the horse, and they're never going to see that cart. They're going to be standing around a dead horse. But that's part of the push the I believe button. You cannot be part of this administration, part of the war fever that they've created, unless you push the believe button. I believe in the inevitable victory. It's coming. I believe. And if you walk in and you talk sensibly, say that's utterly ridiculous, that's no chance of ever happening, then you're going to be thrown out of the meeting. It's the same reason why many good, solid intelligence estimates that tell people the truth about what's really happening in Ukraine on the ground and in Russia never reach the top, because they don't conform to the narrative. At some point, the narrative becomes the truth that must be believed and defended. And there's nothing more effective than a messenger who believes the lie that the messenger is sending.
I want to play it again because I want to pick on the last few words she used. Gary, run it one more time. The last few words she used.
And even as you plan for the counteroffensive, which we have been working on with you for some 4 or 5 months, we are already beginning our discussions with the Ukrainian government and with friends in Kyiv, both in the civilian side and on the military side, about Ukraine's long-term future.
Ukraine's long-term future. The United States State Department is speaking to Ukrainians about Ukraine's long-term future. Does it involve President Zelensky? Will it be dictated by Mrs. Nuland, just as she demanded a coup?
Well, I think you saw evidence for this planning several months ago when you saw a picture of Mr. Zelensky seated at a table with Bank Friedman, who subsequently was revealed as a huge fraud, and Larry Fink from BlackRock. These are some of the key figures that are involved in deciding what's going to happen to Ukraine when, quote unquote, they win. I'm not sure I'd want any of those people deciding the future of anything inside the United States, least of all my home state or the city where I grew up or anything else. But those are the people driving this train. You've got to go back and always ask the question, who are the oligarchs? I always talk about government by donor. The government in Washington doesn't pay any attention to you or me. We're irrelevant. We're not mega donors. The mega donors own Washington, D.C. They're the ones making these decisions. Identify them, figure out who they are, where their money is going. We've seen some in the past, like Zuckerberg, for instance, a good example, but there are many others. They're donating and they're shaping policy. They're determining that we're going to fight this to the bitter end in Ukraine. It's not Biden. Biden's a cutout. He's just a front man. He's being handed the script and he delivers it with enthusiasm. But that's where we are. So none of this should be surprising to the American people. The real question is, how long do they put up with this? And if you're waiting for somebody on the right to stand up and be counted, forget it. You've got plenty of people on the right. They're interested in the donors too. And the donors own most of them. Find somebody who's not donor owned and see what they will do.
Just as an aside, I would imagine that our friend, the great Congressman Andy Biggs, is suffering 1,000 deaths as we speak.
Of course.
Trying to decide how to prevent the government from allowing Joe Biden to borrow without limit, a deal concocted by Republican leadership.
Well, remember, they're poised to violate the Constitution, which puts that in the hands of the House of Representatives. In other words, you can't just press the button and create money over in the Treasury. Right. And the Fed can't do it. But guess what we're going to do? We're going to do that.
Right. It's a terrible state of affairs. I was surprised by the clip we're going to show you now. I guess I had never really paid attention to him. Perhaps you know him, Prime Minister Viktor Orban. I thought this statement that we're now all about to watch was one of the clearest, most articulate, even eloquent statements I've heard from an Eastern European leader on this issue of the war in Ukraine. I'm anxious to hear your thoughts.
You made a great deal about 1956 and fighting for freedom. You have a neighbor who is invaded by Russia, the very country, you grew up with pictures of tanks going into Budapest. Why are you opposing the European aid?
No, it's emotionally. It's tragic. So all of our heart is with the Ukrainians. We understand how much they suffer, but I'm speaking here as a politician who should save lives. So the most important thing for the international political community is to save lives, especially when you are convinced, as I do, that there is no chance to win this war. So therefore, what we should do far more energy invest into to convince everybody that the only solution is ceasefire. And then after the ceasefire, peace talks should start. And then we could back to your point,
But do you really think there is no chance of Ukraine winning?
That's my
point. They stand very little chance of winning without the aid which you are currently blocking.
No, my position is that looking at the reality, looking at the figures, looking at the surroundings, looking at the fact that NATO is not ready to send troops, it's obvious that there is no victory for poor Ukrainians on the battlefield.
Well, I thought he was terrific. What did you think, Colonel?
No, well, he's pragmatic. Most Hungarians are, by the way. And thank God he spoke English, because nobody speaks Hungarian except Hungarians. That language is a built-in security system, and it's always worked brilliantly in war because nobody can understand it. No, Orban's a realist, and he's right. The only thing that I dislike is this comparison of the Soviet era and the Soviet state that existed 80 years ago and what exists today. They are not the same. And the rationale for intervention has nothing to do with the thinking and mentality of the Soviet Union. But that was a British, ostensibly an Englishman, and they are all drunk on this notion that Putin and Russia is the Soviet Union. So that's why he prefaced his remarks. But no, the Ukrainians have no chance of winning, and nobody in Europe is going to send any troops. And we've been saying that for a long time, Judge. Hasn't made any difference.
In the past 24 hours, Evgeny Prigozhin made some very interesting statements about the need for mobilization to collect 2 million mobilized, trained and prepared, and not be meat, M-E-A-T. And until we mobilize, we will not win the special operation. Sounds like yet again he's making a very strong statement intended to reach the ears of President Putin. And some of the stuff's a little terrifying. The country must go to a state of war, and society must be mobilized, ready that it will be necessary to live in these conditions for a long time to come.
I'm not so sure that Vladimir Putin did not discuss this with Prigozhin before he said it. I think it's a mistake to assume that there is some sort of climate of hostility between or around Prigozhin and Putin. I don't see that at all. I think this is very serious, and I think that it's a response to us. Every time the Russians have evinced any interest in a negotiation of any kind, we've refused it categorically. We've presented ultimatum after ultimatum and insisted that unless the Russians pull out of Ukraine completely, not just Ukraine, but the new borders from 1957, which were never Ukrainian, and then ultimately humiliate themselves and bow down and beg for forgiveness, there can be no peace. I think Putin and his colleagues have finally come around to understanding this reality. I don't think they wanted to believe it. It's true. So if it is true, and you take, for instance, the recent announcement where President Biden said, well, we should send the Ukrainians ATACMS. These are the Army Tactical Missile System that reaches out 200 miles. Still delivers a relatively small warhead, but it's nonetheless a good-sized warhead that can do a lot of damage. We said from the beginning that we were not going to provide these kinds of long-range strike weapons to the Ukrainians. Now, all of a sudden, we're going to do it. If you are a Russian and you're listening to this and watching this, you reach the inevitable conclusion that we are escalating.